Thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Paris Schutz. Cook County State's Attorney's primary race still too close to call, with mail-in ballots still being counted.
We are cautiously optimistic, but we have to make sure all the votes are counted.
Tough-on-crime candidate Eileen O'Neill Burke has a slim lead on party-backed opponent Clayton Harris after Tuesday's primary election night comes and goes.
If anyone believes that one issue that we still have to address is going to cause me to put the brakes on my agenda, buckle up.
Mayor Johnson vows to continue the fight for a new graduated real estate sales tax to fund homelessness. This as voters appear to reject the Bring Chicago Home referendum. The result, a blow to his progressive agenda and that of the Chicago Teachers Union. Longtime Chicago Congressman Danny Davis and Chuy Garcia cruise to victory against upstart challengers. City Council settles tens of millions more taxpayer dollars in police misconduct suits. And speaking of taxpayer dollars, Arlington Heights sweetens the tax deal to keep the Bears from moving forward on lakefront stadium plans.
Now to our Week in Review panel. Joining us are Rick Pearson from the Chicago Tribune, Laura Washington, also of the Chicago Tribune and ABC7, our very own Heather Sharon, and Rob Hart from WBBM News Radio, this post-primary election edition of the Week in Review. Heather Sharon, at this moment, where does this state's attorney's count stand?
Well, in process is the best way I can put it. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 60, 70, maybe 80,000 mail-in votes coming from Chicago alone, which maybe as many as 30,000 mail-in votes coming from Cook County suburban residents that have to be counted. We are expecting the bulk of those votes to be counted tonight, Friday, so all I can say is stay tuned and go to our website. We promise to have the latest for you.
Right, and as we're taping right now at 5:30, we do not know the results here. Nobody has conceded or declared victory outright, but that could change as the evening wears on. Do you think that this is a tough margin, though, either way for Clayton Harris to make up? Eileen Burke has held on to a pretty stable lead.
I do, although we have seen as the ballots have come in later that the lead has shrunk from 8,800 to about 8,100. But I think the trends are such where you have to pick up so much more than what you're down by that I think it probably is leaning in her direction.
It seems like Clayton Harris has the city vote a little over Burke. Burke has a suburban vote over Harris. Do we know where the outstanding votes are at this point to be counted?
Well, now that we're talking about the mail-in ballots, we don't really know. And on top of that, when you're looking at an election where the turnout was so low to begin with, I mean, you have 100,000 outstanding ballots. The question is, did they actually fill them out and put them back in the mail?
Right, and there might be a large percentage of those that never come back. Laura Washington, let's say that this result holds up. Is this a rebuke to the Kim Foxx approach to the state's attorney's office, the Tony Preckwinkle approach of going softer on low-level crime?
Well, it will certainly indicate that the Clayton Harris, who is going to be the keeper of that going forward, Tony Preckwinkle, Kim Foxx, very staunch criminal justice reform advocates were supporting him. But the turnout was so low, and if you look at the numbers in terms of who prevails, it's not necessarily a mandate. And I think Eileen O'Neill Burke understood that in her campaign, and she was really pushing, accountability, tough on crime, but she was also saying that she wanted to carry on some of the reforms that Kim Foxx had put into place. So I don't think that you're going to see a radical change. I think that everyone in this county, well, not everyone, but leadership accepts the fact that criminal justice reform is important, that we need to be able to balance justice with crime. And I think that that's going to remain a value. It's just how you're going to execute that strategy.
And one of the main attractive features of Eileen O'Neill Burke to the business community was she was going to more forcefully prosecute retail theft.
That's right. She made that sort of the big area of difference between her and Clayton Harris. I'm going to push back a little bit on this emerging narrative of sort of a low turnout election. So right now the turnout is at 22.9%. And the last time there was an unopposed incumbent Democratic president running for re-election in Illinois, the turnout was 24%. So I think that we're going to see a very similar turnout this time around as we did in 2012. I don't know that we can make any sort of sweeping sort of conclusions about voter apathy or anything like that. Now, certainly the progressives hoped that the combination of Bring Chicago Home and the ability to elect a successor for Kim Foxx was going to boost those numbers, but I just don't think that turned out.
Well, and when you look at the top of the ticket, there is no enthusiasm there for Joe Biden, and the numbers will show that.
And it's not a competitive primary.
It's still,
really.
still, you had a dropout between the people who didn't vote for president, Democrats who cast a ballot, who didn't vote for president, or voted for president and didn't vote for Joe Biden. That was 1 in 4 Democrat ballots.
But I think that it does make a statement. Yes, maybe this is a similar turnout to what we've had in the past, but we're in an era where there's all this talk and debate about saving our democracy and how important it is to be engaged and to vote. And this is the response we get from voters in a presidential primary year. I think it raises questions about how, about voter apathy and what we can expect in November. If I were Joe Biden, I'd be really worried about turnout.
Well, I'm not sure it's just voter apathy. It's also, we have such divides that exist. People don't want to be. They don't want to vote. They don't want to be identified.
Well, I'm going to take the opposite take, though, on how Joe Biden did, not only in Cook County and in the city of Chicago as well, and that is statewide in Illinois, he beat his old boss in the last uncontested primary. He got more votes than Barack Obama did in 2012, and with a more crowded field. Obviously, the 3 other, Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips, were also out, but in 2012, Obama was running against Randall Terry, the anti-abortion advocate who was running as a Democrat that year. So, and on top of that, he did better in the city of Chicago than a lot of the ballot initiatives did as well. Yeah, talking about those ballots that were blank, those Democratic ballots where there was not a candidate for president, maybe we're talking about ancestral Democrats who are now Republicans who pulled a Democratic ballot to vote for or against Bring Chicago Home, or to vote for or against.
Encouraging that.
Right, to vote for or against, to vote in the state's attorney's primary. Maybe that was going on, but he still walked away with 91% of the vote in a granted, in a low turnout election.
Well, let's talk about Lori and I were just talking about this. This is the brave new world of election results, right? When you have 50% of the ballots being cast by mail, the voting is going to be different. The results are going to come in different. And I am including myself in this, but our job is to sort of, take data in and make conclusions and sort of figure out what it all means. I think it's really problematic to do that with literally tens of thousands of votes yet to be counted. And I think that it would behoove us all as sort of a news media to sort of take a deep breath, say, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. That's hard when we want to sort of tell people what happened.
Right. Well, we don't need to know everything on election night. And the other issue with early voting is that people are making decisions much earlier now, and they're making decisions perhaps before all the information that they need to be informed comes out.
Or before candidates have dropped out.
Exactly. Which we see.
Let's talk about the presidential race. In the case of the Republican primary, Nikki Haley dropped out, but Donald Trump still, in these March 19th primary dates, getting about
73%. Right.
Yeah, good.
Which I think also
20+% not voting for him.
Right.
So does that spell doom for him in the general election?
Well, I think these are factors to look at on both sides. And again, with both of them, you'd have 2 lack of enthusiasm candidates. Now, these are supposed to be the partisans that are showing up at the ballot because it's a partisan election on both sides. And I think that shows real weakness, particularly in the suburbs, for Republicans who are trying to recapture their old stomping grounds from Democrats. When you're getting 73% in DuPage County for Donald Trump, those suburban women, they're not going to be with Donald Trump. I mean, it does not bode well for Republicans in the suburbs with that.
You mean
kind
they're not going to be with Donald Trump at the fall?
They're not going to be with him in the fall.
Sure.
Right.
So it's kind of a false.
And you wonder if that protest vote against Biden, if it's related to Gaza, if some of those folks do end up voting in the general election.
And that's the thing is, and of course, everybody, the old adage about we have our divisions, but everybody comes home again. I don't know if everybody comes home again this time.
Well, the youth vote was abominable. It was something like 14% or 17% of that key age group between 25 and 35. That was what the turnout there. And every year it's a perennial point. We're going to get young voters energized. Joe Biden's got all of his social media all geared up to get them out, and it doesn't happen.
The thing in Chicago, though, is we just had a mayoral election, and before that we had national elections. It's election fatigue. The way these elections are scheduled out in Chicago.
Well, there was an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal last week about what what is it, Gen Z now? What's beyond Gen Z? What's on beyond millennials? Who are we?
Yes, Gen
who are we mad at today?
Yeah.
And now it's Gen Z, and it was explaining what's their thought process. What are they thinking going into the election year? And this is a generation that when they were about to graduate from high school or they're about to go to prom, everything shut down 4 years ago. This is the COVID generation, and that's in the back of their mind, that things could disappear and shut down and go away in a matter of a week. And I think they believe, they look at their parents going absolutely nuts about politics one way or the other on Facebook, reevaluating friendships because of that, and they say, this is not really applying to me. And all these debates, they don't really make a difference to me. All I know is that I graduated from high school with my head spinning, and I'm still trying to get my bearings 4 years later.
Well, isn't that always true with younger voters, though, that they don't really relate to? First of all, we have two of the oldest candidates in history running for president, and the issues that they're running on are just not issues that really, except for maybe Gaza, are not issues that they really care about. So they're not going to respond.
Other than abortion, it seems like most of the issues are tailored to an older voting population. We got to talk about the Bring Chicago Home referendum. At this point, nothing's been officially called on it, but that is very likely headed for defeat.
It's facing a pretty significant hole of almost 20,000 votes, and I think most people would be pretty shocked if it was able to sort of close that gap with these mail-in ballots. And I think that you did not hear a lot of optimism from Mayor Brandon Johnson or the supporters of the proposal this week at City Hall. They're sort of preparing to sort of figure out what's next. How do we make the case? Do they try again in November, which I think is a real option, or do they sort of go at the problem of homelessness in a different way? It will be hard because this was not an initiative of Mayor Brandon Johnson. This started all the way back in 2017. It was blocked by former Mayor Lori Lightfoot. He sort of, embraced it during the campaign and then got fully on the bandwagon once in office. So there are a lot of people who've been working a long time for Tuesday's vote who are very, very disappointed and are trying to figure out what's next.
At the same time, Brandon Johnson did put his full weight behind it, especially when he campaigned. So it's hard to not see this as perhaps a blow to him and his agenda.
I think so, and I do think part of the rejection of it is a referendum on his first year in office. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions, and if you look at those negative opposition ads, they were all about the mayor. They are you happy with the way things are? Do you basically trust the mayor with $100 million of tax money that is not segregated out for a purpose?
I agree, and the other issue is the migrant issue. I think that played a role as well.
Yes.
Because this is about homelessness, and we have thousands of migrants right now who don't have homes, and I think there's a lot of concern that we're bringing on additional burdens of homeless people that we really can't support.
Well, it's the UBS Maya of taking care of, what about
taking care of me?
Right,
Where's mine?
Right.
But Rob Hart to Brandon Johnson, the mayor, saying he's going to double down. He's not giving up on this. Is it smart politics to try and go after this again, or maybe to look at these results and change your tack a little bit in response to where perhaps the electorate is going?
Well, first off, I think this was a tough sledding to begin with. Just go back to 4 years ago, Governor J.B. Pritzker, who won by a much larger margin in 2018 compared to Brandon Johnson last year, who had a lot more friends in Springfield, trying to get the graduated income tax over the line, who actually had high marks from the electorate in 2020 because of his handling of COVID, and the income tax referendum went down to defeat. It's just very early on in the process, either you're 2 years into office or less than a year, to ask for a referendum that either radically changes the tax code or asks for a whole lot of money. And in the case of Bring Chicago Home, it didn't answer some basic questions. How are you going to address homelessness? Are you going to build more affordable housing? Are you going to bring in more social services? And there's even a dispute over the count. The Chicago Coalition for the Homeless saying there's 64,000 people who are unhoused in Chicago. The city's count says 6,000, 5,000 in shelters, and 1,000 on the street.
And the Coalition for the Homeless includes folks that might couch surf or stay at relatives' places. So
yes.
Huge discrepancy in those numbers. And you're right, there was not specifics in terms of how this money was going to be spent, what the plan was going to be. They were saying, well, give us the money first, and then we're going to have an advisory council that sort of puts all this together. Maybe they choose to go a different tack if they put this referendum on the ballot again.
Maybe even shorter. I think that was also
far less complicated.
Far less complicated. Maybe people didn't understand. Or could they say, well, all these legal challenges and rulings, everyone was confused, so we shouldn't really even, we should take these results with a grain of salt.
Well, but they chose to put it on the ballot now as opposed to November because they thought they would have a better shot at it,
in a primary.
In a primary. So if they couldn't pass it this time around, what's going to make the difference in November?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was sort of a rock and a hard place, right? Because the November election, there's going to be the Trump of it all, right? So it's going to be very, very hard to break through in terms of earned media and sort of to capture people's attention. I also think they were between a rock and a hard place with the sort of the length of the ballot question because they faced accusations of log rolling, of trying to do too much with the ballot question. So is there a sweet spot? I mean, maybe, but I think a lot of people were confused. Was it on the ballot? Was it not on the ballot? Would it count? Was it not going to count? Now, I heard from a lot of the supporters that this was going to redound to their benefit because people were talking about Bring Chicago Home, but we weren't talking about the substance of Bring Chicago Home. We were talking about, is it on the ballot? Is it not? Is it legal? Is it not? So there was not a lot of sort of focus on what exactly this would do or sort of what would happen after the vote if it passed or if it failed. I think the supporters are deeply frustrated.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the congressional races. Not a big surprise, Danny Davis, he beats back multiple challengers, gets over 50% of the vote. Chuy Garcia beats back the more conservative Ray Lopez, a city council member, very handily. But then downstate Republican Mike Bost, he gets the Trump endorsement. Darren Bailey, who had run for governor, thought that maybe he could get the Trump, and he was more Trumpier than Mike Bost. Turned out Trump himself thought Bost was Trumpy enough.
This one, I think, is a very interesting one to go back and look at because, yes, after Mike Bost, the 5-term incumbent, both of them conservative, Bailey running to out-conservative, far conservative, that Bost gets the endorsement from Donald Trump, and everybody was kind of thinking on the outside, game over. Bailey just kept going, almost as if Trump's endorsement didn't matter. He still loved Trump and was going to support Trump, and ends up Bost wins by like 2,500 votes. It almost looks like, to me, the MAGA movement may have, in some respects, in some of these areas, surpassed Donald Trump. And that this is
Bailey certainly has built up a name down there. Heather, I see. Do we have an update?
The results are in.
Okay.
I am trying to use my phone like a digital native that I am not to try to figure out what it is. So we'll see if I can scroll
Gen
through.
Z person
Yes, that's what we need. I'm too old for this.
But Rick, on your point about Bailey and Bost, hasn't the district changed too? Isn't that part of the issue that Bost had a lot of new voters that were not familiar to him?
This was the second time around with those voters.
Okay, so,
and in fact, it's the old Eastern Bloc, we referred to it in Springfield, and literally Interstate 57, everybody west of the southern third of the state voted for Mike Bost, the incumbent. Everybody to the east voted for Bailey, and that's Mary Miller's old territory, and Mary Miller, one of the most conservative members of Congress.
Rob Hart, any other results surprise you? For instance, how is Mariana Spyropoulos going to be different as Cook County Circuit Court Clerk than Iris Martinez?
It's very interesting because I was looking at the candidate questionnaire on the Channel 11 website as we were approaching Election Day, and a lot of the questions were, so, Iris Martinez, what about this? Why haven't you fixed this? Why is this still going on? What's going on here? What's going on
Why are we
there?
still using carbon paper in there?
Right. So in the case
Although
of,
I have to say some of those records have been digitized,
Yes,
more so than under Dorothy Brown.
And
they're making some slow progress.
I mean, it's a lot of paper, and it takes a long time to bring an office that was in the 20th century into the 21st century. But we're talking about the ability of organizations to sway elections, and in this case, this was where the Tony Preckwinkle organization actually had an undisputed win. They had a well-funded candidate, and she got her people to go out and vote for Mariana Spyropoulos. On the congressional side, though, and this goes back to the discussion of Joe Biden and enthusiasm, Danny Davis wins. So you can't count out an old tiger, even with
81 years old,
even with a number of candidates going after him. And you also wonder to yourself, is this an audition for some of the people who are running against him?
Well, and I made this point earlier this week. You know, Danny Davis, when there was flooding, he was out there in the community. It comes down to, do residents think that you're working on behalf of our interests, our local interests, perhaps more so than ideology.
Well, it's the old story about if you ask people about Congress, it's Congress stinks.
But I like
down,
my congressman.
But I love my congressman. Yeah.
Right. I want to get back to a city issue, Heather. Almost immediately after the election, the mayor's chief of staff, Rich Gaitis, is stepping down. Not even a year into the job.
Can I break in
Go,
for
break
some
the
breaking
news, break the
news?
news.
Clayton Harris III is now in the lead in the race for
Wow.
the state's attorney with 51.48% of the vote to 48.52%
Wow. That's a stunning
for
turnaround.
Eileen O'Neill Burke. This is a massive shift in, I think, the narrative of this entire election. So,
and it gets to your point of why we have to wait.
You heard it here on Week in Review
Come
first.
in.
You heard it here first. Clayton Harris jumps out to a stunning lead.
Is that the final count for the evening? Okay.
It is not. There are more ballots that, as long as they were postmarked by election night on midnight or they were dropped off on election day, if they arrive by April 2nd, they will be counted. But that is
certainly a stunning turn of events, and then maybe a sign that the Preckwinkle organization didn't do so poorly in this either, given the fact that Eileen O'Neill Burke outraised Clayton Harris by quite a bit, 3-1.
Right.
I would say that this is similar to the pattern that we saw after the mayoral runoff. Now, it didn't matter because Johnson was leading on election night, but between election night and when the final votes were counted and the election was certified, Johnson moved about 3 percentage points away from Vallis. Now, nobody noticed except for me because I get paid to notice that sort of thing. But this is a similar sort of change that shows that deeply progressive voters are committed to voting by mail in a way that voters of sort of other political persuasions are not.
So we still might not know for a while because they have to be postmarked, so we might have to wait another week and a half.
There are more trenches of
And a
mail votes to
significant
come.
of those votes are from the suburbs too, which I would think would be O'Neill Burke's territory. So that may even out things depending on where they're coming from.
All right, so stay tuned. Keep the eyes on our website, WTTW.com. I know Heather will update that.
I got a lot of work to do all of a sudden.
All right, so what about this issue of the mayor's chief of staff, Rich Gaitis? Now, he's interesting because he's kind of an institutional guy. He goes back to the Daley days, and now he's leaving.
Well, when he was hired, he was like a sign of stability for a new, untested mayor.
The business community was delighted because they felt like there would be a grown-up in their view, a grown-up in the room, and that he understood how city government worked. And Mayor Johnson does not, and many of the people around him, they're activists. They're not bureaucrats. So,
and knew how big events work. And so that, to me, is what's surprising.
You think he was going to stay on for the DNC?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Does that signal perhaps a rift then? That maybe he's not happy with the way Johnson has tacked so far, or the advice that he's getting? Maybe he's not listening to Gaitis as much as some of these other folks?
It would seem to me that there are definitely some issues for him to step out, yes.
and I'm wondering, though, if they might bring him back in some kind of consulting role, because he's really almost a singular person in terms of having the skill to be able to manage a big event like the DNC, and it's in Johnson's interest to make sure that goes well.
All right, I want to bring up Heather. Is there more breaking news?
Nope,
Okay.
I'm just double checking.
Just double checking. Very good journalist. I just want to bring up this other issue that we learned about today in the ongoing saga of how to settle serious police misconduct cases. So a judge is now ruling that the arbitration process, which the FOP had fought for because they want it to be kind of out of public view, will actually have to be in public view. Is this the final word on it?
So it's not. This decision could be appealed, and it likely will be. So what this means, though, is that everybody got a little bit of something that they wanted. The police union wanted the ability to have an arbitrator make this decision, and so they got that. And the city wanted to make sure that these decisions were made in public, which means essentially that the city, if this decision is upheld, is going to have to create a whole new police arbitration system. And what that all means, we will have to see.
All right, we'll also have to see whether or not the Bears end their flirtation with the city, or they choose to go home to Arlington Heights. Now Arlington Heights is sweetening the tax pot. Who's winning here? Who's winning this battle between the lakefront and Arlington Heights?
I would love more than anything to get in touch with a time traveler and take me to 2034 just so I can see where the White Sox are playing and where the Bears are playing. I mean, I have always been of the mind that Arlington Heights is this is the natural conclusion to a 50-year process. They wanted to build an Arlington Heights stadium in the mid-1970s. And so this has been going on for decades. They have the land, the transit connections there, and all they have to do is build a highway connection that can make this happen. But the more you hear about the city proposal, the more you think maybe they're serious about staying by Soldier Field and building this new dome stadium in the south parking lot.
They've put up numbers, and now apparently they've met with Friends of the Parks, a group that was going to oppose them building on the lakefront.
Doesn't mean they're not going to still oppose them building on lakefront. I don't see how any of this
But it
happens
means it's
without.
probably not a bluff, that they're taking it seriously.
I think it's part of the progression of how you do things. I still think
We've got a little bit more breaking news.
Okay.
We just had more ballots dropped from suburban Cook County, which means Eileen O'Neill Burke is back in the lead.
By how much?
By about 6,786 votes.
Okay, you heard it here first
so
again.
Here we go. It is
breaking news. Burke is back in the
live
lead.
Television,
Just the way we began the show.
I was going to say, can you strike my comments about mail-in ballots from the record? But now they're relevant again.
They are relevant. All right. Well, you've all been relevant tonight, but we're out of time. So our thanks to Rick Pearson, Laura Washington, Heather Sharon, and Rob Hart. We're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation. Additional support is provided by.
And that's our show for this Friday night. Don't forget you can get Chicago Tonight and the Week in Review streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. Now for the Week in Review, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe. And until there's another dump in that race and another lead change, we will see you on Monday. We have to talk about Blommers.
Oh,
the
it's so
late breaking news
sad.
that Blommers
The chocolate smell.
That stinks.
Tip your waiters, folks.
You could smell that smell 2-3 miles away.
Yes,
On a windy day.
Chicago's
That was
no
the-
longer the
that-
chocolate city, you know.
That was the sweetness of Chicago right
Franco
there.
Mints, all the other good
And
goodies.
the end of an industrial era, too. That was the last customer on that.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud to recognize its 18 attorneys selected for the 2024 Super Lawyers List.